The year is 2026. The Supreme Court of the United States is days away from ruling on the biggest tax case in modern American history, and most Americans have no idea they're the ones on trial. Because right now, as you watch this, there is a $200 billion invoice sitting on the kitchen table of every household in America. It was never voted on. It was never debated. It was stamped with the words "Tariff" and slid under the door while everyone was arguing about something else. But let's get one thing straight before the spin doctors get their hands on this story. This is not about trade theory. This is not about geopolitics. This is about a receipt. A very specific receipt that shows who actually paid for the most sweeping tariff regime in nearly a century. And the answer, backed by 25 million shipping records covering $4 trillion in trade, is you. 96%. You. Imagine your boss announces a new policy. He calls it Liberation Day. He says from now on your biggest competitor is going to fund your raise. All you have to do is sit back and collect. Sounds great, right? Except when the first paycheck arrives, the raise isn't there. Instead, there is a deduction. Your take-home pay is lower. And when you call payroll, they say, "Oh yeah, the competitor didn't pay. We just took it out of your check." How do you raise $200 billion in 1 year? Call it a foreign tax, and have 96% of it paid by your own citizens. How do you promise to bring back manufacturing and then lose 72,000 factory jobs in 8 months? How do you declare a trade war to close the deficit and then watch the deficit set a new record? Today, we're not debating tariffs in the abstract. We are opening the books. This is the forensic audit of the largest hidden tax increase in a generation. This is who really pays the tariff. The data they don't show you. To understand why 96% of tariff costs land on American wallets, we have to go back to a fundamental misunderstanding that has been weaponized for political gain. It starts with a word, tariff. And if you skipped Econ 101, here is the Explain It Like I Am 5 version. A tariff is not a bill you send to China. A tariff is a tax that an American company pays at the U.S. border when it brings a product into the country. Not the Chinese company, not the Vietnamese factory. The American importer writes the check to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Think of it like this. Imagine you own a furniture store in Ohio. You buy tables from a factory in Vietnam for $50 each. The government slaps a 25% tariff on Vietnamese furniture. Does the Vietnamese factory suddenly owe the U.S. government $12.50? Number you do. You, the furniture store owner in Ohio, now pay $62.50 for the same table, and you have 3 options: eat the cost and watch your margins die, raise the price and watch your customers leave, or close up shop. That is the tariff mechanism. It has always been the tariff mechanism, and this isn't controversial economics. This is how tariffs have worked since the founding of the Republic. Alexander Hamilton knew it. Abraham Lincoln knew it. Every Treasury Secretary for 250 years has known it. The debate was never about how they work. It was about whether they're worth the cost. You can argue that tariffs protect infant industries. You can argue they serve as leverage in negotiations. You can argue they address genuine national security concerns. Those are legitimate debates that serious economists have had for centuries. But somewhere between the campaign rally and the executive order, a different claim was made. Not that tariffs are worth the cost, but that there is no cost. That foreign countries write the check and Americans cash it. That claim is not a policy position. It is a factual assertion, and it is provably, mathematically, empirically wrong. And in January 2026, we now have the most comprehensive data set in history proving it catastrophically wrong. This is nail number 1. The 96% receipt. In January 2026, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, one of the oldest economic research institutions in Europe, published a study that should have been a 5-alarm fire in every newsroom in America. The researchers analyzed over 25 million individual shipping records, not estimates, not models. Actual bills of lading covering nearly $4 trillion in U.S. imports between January 2024 and November 2025. Their finding was devastating in its clarity. Foreign exporters absorbed only about 4% of the tariff burden. The remaining 96% passed through to us buyers. Let me say that again because it deserves to land. Out of every dollar collected in tariffs, 96 cents came from American businesses and consumers. 4 cents came from foreign companies lowering their prices. 4 cents, the study's lead author, Julian Hinds, put it bluntly. The claim that foreign countries pay these tariffs is a myth. The data show the opposite. Americans are footing the bill. The $200 billion surge in customs revenue in 2025 represents $200 billion extracted from American businesses and households. But maybe you are thinking, well, maybe the foreign companies will lower their prices eventually. Maybe they just need time. The Keel team tested that too. They specifically looked at Brazil and India, both of which faced sudden tariff increases to 50% in August 2025. If foreign exporters were absorbing the tariffs, their prices to the US would have dropped relative to what they charged Europe or Canada. But the prices didn't drop, not 1 cent. What did drop was the volume. Indian exports to the US fell between 18 and 24%. They simply shipped less. They found other customers. They didn't eat the cost. They just left. And that brings us to nail number 2, the invisible tax bracket, because here's what the raw receipt doesn't tell you. This isn't just a tax, it is a regressive tax. It hits the people who can least afford it the hardest, and the data on that is just as damning. Yale University's Budget Lab, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research groups in the country, has been tracking tariff impacts since Liberation Day. Their November 2025 analysis is a masterclass in how policy choices become kitchen table crises. The overall price level rose by 1.2% in the short run from all 2025 tariffs. That translates to an average loss of $1,700 per each household. But here is where it gets ugly. For households at the bottom of the income distribution, the loss was $900. Now, $900 might sound like less than $1,700, and it is in absolute terms. But as a share of income, the burden on the poorest 10% of households is more than 3 times the burden on the richest 10%. 3 times. Let me put that in perspective. A family earning $40,000 a year just lost $900 to a tax they never voted for. That is 2 weeks of groceries. That is a month of car insurance. That is the copay on a kid's emergency room visit. Meanwhile, a household earning $500,000 a year lost $5,000, which they probably didn't even notice. And this regressivity isn't an accident. It is baked into the mechanics. Tariffs are consumption taxes. They fall on goods, not income. And poor people spend a larger share of their income on goods than rich people do. A billionaire doesn't spend 10 times more on shoes than a middle-class family. He might spend twice as much, but his income is 1,000 times larger. So the tariff as a percentage of income is invisible to the rich and crushing to the poor. Economists have a word for this: regressive, and it is the most politically inconvenient word in the tariff debate. Because the voters who were promised the most relief from tariffs are the ones paying the highest proportional cost. The Tax Foundation confirmed this. The tariffs amount to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. They called it the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. And unlike a normal tax increase, this one was never debated by Congress, never put to a vote, and never subjected to the scrutiny that even the most minor tax bill receives on Capitol Hill. But if you think the household cost is bad, wait until you see what it did to the people who were supposed to benefit the most: the factory workers, the manufacturers, the ones who were told their jobs were coming back. Because when the data came in, it wasn't a comeback. It was a funeral. This is nail number 3. The manufacturing betrayal on April 2, 2025, a date the administration branded as Liberation Day. The president stood in the Rose Garden and made a promise. Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. That was the sales pitch. Tariffs would force companies to build things in America again. Factories would reopen, workers would return, the Rust Belt would shine. Here is what actually happened. According to federal data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in every single month after Liberation Day, manufacturing companies reduced their workforce. Every single month by the end of 2025, the United States had lost 72,000 manufacturing jobs since April. Not gained, lost. The sector that was supposed to be liberated was being gutted. And this wasn't a continuation of some long-term trend that started years ago. Under the previous administration, manufacturing construction spending had surged, driven by the CHIPS Act and investments in renewable energy and semiconductors. That spending declined in 2025. The tariffs didn't replace it. They replaced momentum with paralysis. Manufacturing construction spending fell by $121.2 billion, comparing the first 8 months of 2024 to the first 8 months of 2025. That is not a slowdown. That is a cliff. The very investment in factories, in physical buildings where people make things, collapsed. And the Purchasing Managers Index, the monthly survey that measures factory activity, has been declining since January 2025. The manufacturing sector isn't just not growing, it is contracting. And here is a number that should stop every trade policy optimist in their tracks. The U.S. lost 68,000 manufacturing jobs in all of 2025, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. 68,000 in the year that was supposed to be the Great Reshoring, the year of Liberation Day, the year the factories were coming home. They didn't come home. They didn't even call. But here is the cruel irony, and it is the kind that would make a Hollywood writer blush. The reason manufacturing jobs were disappearing wasn't despite the tariffs. It was because of them. American manufacturers don't just sell finished products, they buy parts, they import components. Steel for car frames, aluminum for aircraft, semiconductors for electronics, chemicals for plastics. When you slap a 25% tariff on imported steel, you don't just hurt the Chinese steel mill. You hurt the American car factory that needs that steel to build cars. An economist at the American Enterprise Institute put it plainly. Given that U.S. producers rely heavily on imported intermediary goods, wild swings in tariffs are hugely destabilizing. When firms can't forecast their costs, they can't determine which investments are likely to generate profits. So companies stopped investing. They stopped hiring. They froze. The policy uncertainty was the tariff's second bullet. The first was cost. The second was chaos. And what about the trade deficit? Surely that got better, right? That was the other big promise. Tariffs would shrink the gap between what America buys from the world and what it sells. Oh, my sweet summer child. This is nail number 4, the deficit delusion. The trade deficit in manufactured goods was $131.3 billion higher in the first 9 months of 2025 compared to the first 9 months of 2024. Higher, not lower. Higher. The goods trade deficit for 2025 was on track to set a new record, potentially surpassing the previous record of $1.21 trillion set in 2024. Let me contextualize that. The entire justification for the most aggressive tariff regime since the 1930s was to shrink the trade deficit. Instead, it grew. It is like putting your house on a diet and watching it gain weight. Meanwhile, China, the primary target of the whole trade war, just posted a record $1.2 trillion trade surplus globally. The tariffs didn't hurt China's trade with the world. They just redirected it. China found other customers: Vietnam, India, Brazil, Indonesia. The trade didn't disappear. It rerouted. America lost market share while paying more for the privilege, and the monthly trade figures have been swinging wildly, reflecting the chaos of the policy itself. March 2025 saw a deficit of $136 billion as importers panic, bought ahead of Liberation Day. October saw a historically low $29 billion as front-loaded inventory cleared the pipeline. November bounced back to $57 billion. The trade data looks like an electrocardiogram during a heart attack. Wild swings, no stability, no trend toward improvement. Why? Because tariffs don't work the way a bumper sticker implies. When you make imports more expensive, you don't automatically make exports more competitive. What you actually do is make everything more expensive to produce domestically, because American factories need imported inputs. So American products become more expensive on the global market. Your trading partners retaliate with their own tariffs on your exports. And the deficit stays the same or gets worse, while everyone's poorer. U.S. exports fell 16% in the long run under these tariff policies. According to the Budget Lab at Yale, 16%. Agricultural exports, the lifeblood of rural America, took a direct hit as trading partners retaliated. The farmers who were promised protection found themselves on the front lines of a trade war they didn't start and couldn't win. And that brings us to the next charge, the one that makes economists lose sleep. This is nail number 5. The ghost of Smoot-Hawley. Because we've been here before. Almost exactly 100 years ago, America tried this same experiment. And the results were catastrophic. In June 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Sound familiar? It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. The idea was the same. Protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. Keep the money at home. The result: global trade collapsed by 65%. U.S. exports fell from $7 billion to $2.5 billion. Unemployment, which stood at 8% when the act passed, soared to 25% by 1933. More than 1,000 economists signed a petition begging Hoover not to sign the bill. Henry Ford spent an evening at the White House trying to convince him to veto it. J.P. Morgan's chief executive said he almost went down on his knees to stop it. Hoover signed it anyway. And Smoot-Hawley didn't just deepen the depression, it triggered a global trade war. Canada retaliated within months. Then France, then the United Kingdom, then 20 more countries. Everyone put up walls. And behind every wall, people starved. Now, am I saying that the 2025 tariffs are identical to Smoot-Hawley? The global economy is vastly more interconnected today. The financial system has safety nets that didn't exist in 1930. But the mechanism is the same, and the warnings are the same, and the hubris is exactly the same. Because the current average effective tariff rate in the United States is 16.8%. That is the highest since 1935. We are back in Smoot-Hawley territory, not metaphorically, literally. By the numbers. Ronald Reagan, the patron saint of the Republican Party, said this in 1986. The Smoot-Hawley tariff ignited an international trade war and helped sink our country into the Great Depression. That wasn't a Democrat talking, that was Reagan. And he wasn't speaking from ignorance. He had watched the post-war economic miracle, the one built on exactly the opposite policy: lower tariffs, open trade, the GATT agreement, the WTO, NAFTA. Every Republican president from Eisenhower to Bush followed that playbook, and it worked. American GDP per capita more than tripled from 1945 to 2000. But here is the twist that makes this a forensic audit and not just a history lesson. The 2025 tariffs aren't just similar to Smoot-Hawley in philosophy. They're similar in mechanism. The 1930 Act raised tariffs on over 20,000 goods. The 2025 regime imposed tariffs on virtually all imports from virtually all countries. Smoot-Hawley brought the average tariff to roughly 40% on dutiable goods. The 2025 tariffs, at their peak on Liberation Day, brought the average effective rate to 22.5% across all imports, including previously duty-free goods. The economists who warned Hoover signed a petition of 1,000. The economists warning today number in the thousands, backed by institutions from Yale to the Federal Reserve. The pattern is the same. The warnings are the same. The difference is we've had 95 years to learn the lesson, and we're repeating the exam anyway. This is nail number 6. The price tag on your kitchen table, because all these macro numbers, the trillions, the percentages, the GDP impacts, they can feel abstract. So, let's bring it home. Let's open your refrigerator, your closet, and your Amazon cart and see exactly what the tariff is costing you. According to the Budget Lab at Yale, apparel prices increased by over 20% in the short run from the 2025 tariffs. Shoes even higher. Leather products, including handbags and footwear, jumped over 20%. In the long run, even after companies scramble to find new suppliers and consumers switch to alternatives, shoe and clothing prices remain 7% higher than they would have been without the tariffs. Electronics. Consumer electronics and electrical equipment saw price increases of 17 to 18% in the short run. That is your laptop, your phone case, your kid's tablet, your coffee machine, your air fryer. Food prices rose 1.2% in the short run and stayed 1% higher in the long run. That sounds small until you remember that grocery margins are razor thin. A 1% increase across the food supply means billions of dollars transferred from kitchen tables to customs ledgers. In the auto sector, cars now carry a 25% tariff, with an exemption only for US content. The average car has parts from dozens of countries. The tariff doesn't just hit foreign cars. It hits the American assembled car with a Canadian transmission, a Mexican wiring harness, and a Japanese sensor array. The Harvard Business School Pricing Lab tracked retail price increases in real time. They found steep increases in clothing accessories, jewelry, household tools, toys, and personal care products. The products that fill the shopping carts of ordinary families. And here is the detail that should make your blood boil. It is not just imported goods that got more expensive. Domestic products got more expensive too. Why? Two reasons. First, domestic producers use imported components. An American-made washing machine still needs imported parts. Second, when you remove foreign competition by making imports more expensive, domestic companies have room to raise their prices too. Why would you keep your price at $100 when your foreign competitor just got slapped with a tariff that makes their product cost $125? You raise your price to $115, pocket the difference. Thank you, tariff. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said tariffs were responsible for the entirety of inflation's rise above the Fed's 2% target in 2025. The entirety inflation ended the year at 2.7%. Without tariffs, it would have been at or near the Fed's target. Think about what that means. Every complaint about inflation in 2025, every news segment about the high cost of living, the tariffs were the culprit. Not supply chains, not greedy corporations. The tariff, the policy that was supposed to help. This is nail number 7, the small business guillotine. Because if the tariff is a headache for families buying groceries, it is a death sentence for the businesses that sell them. And the data here is staggering. The Center for American Progress estimated that in September 2025, small businesses that import goods paid an average of roughly $42,600 per month in tariffs. Per month, if that monthly amount persists throughout 2026, the typical small importing business will pay more than $500,000 in tariffs next year. $500,000. For a small business, let me put that in perspective. The average small business in America has annual revenue of about $500,000, which means the tariff in some cases is larger than the entire business. Goldman Sachs found that as of August 2025, businesses had absorbed 51% of tariff costs, passing along 37% to consumers in higher prices. But that absorption rate is dropping fast. JP Morgan projected that the share of tariffs borne by businesses could shrink from 80% in 2025 to 2026. In 2026, the dam is breaking. The costs that businesses have been eating are about to flood into consumer prices. A lot of our clients really didn't want to pass the costs on, said Kyle Peacock, a tariff consultant. But now they're really having to, and the small businesses that can't pass on the cost, they close. They lay off workers, they cancel expansion plans, they become another empty storefront on Main Street. This is the hidden body count of the tariff, not in GDP charts and help wanted signs that go dark. This is nail number 8, the retaliation trap, because tariffs don't happen in a vacuum. You punch, they punch back, and the people who get hurt aren't the ones throwing the punches. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on its trading partners, those partners didn't just absorb the blow. They retaliated. Canada, the European Union, China, Mexico, India, Brazil, Japan, South Korea. They all hit back with tariffs of their own, specifically targeting American exports. And what do those countries target? Agriculture, whiskey, motorcycles. The products made in the political heartland of the United States. This is not an accident. Retaliation is always surgical. You hit your opponent where it hurts politically, not economically. China didn't tariff New York hedge fund services. They tariffed Iowa soybeans. The EU didn't tariff Silicon Valley software. They tariffed Kentucky bourbon and Wisconsin dairy. The trade war is always a war on the heartland. And the results are in the numbers. U.S. imports from China fell 28% year-over-year in 2025, according to project tracking data, but U.S. exports to China fell even more, 38%. Read that again. The country we were supposedly punishing reduced their purchases of American goods by 38%. That is American farmers and ranchers and manufacturers losing customers, not Chinese consumers. American sellers. The Budget Lab estimated that all 2025 tariffs plus foreign retaliation would cause us exports to fall 16% in the long run. That is not just a number. That is American farmers unable to sell their soybeans to China. That is Kentucky bourbon distillers losing their European customers. That is Harley-Davidson dealers watching their overseas orders evaporate. And the overall economy, GDP growth slowed by 0.5 percentage point in both 2025 and 2026. Because of the tariffs, the U.S. economy is persistently 0.3% smaller in the long run. That is $90 billion a year, every year, forever. Or, at least as long as the tariffs remain. The unemployment rate rose by 0.3 percentage points by the end of 2025 and 0.6 percentage points by the end of 2026. That translates to roughly 460,000 fewer jobs. These aren't hypothetical jobs. These are real paychecks that real families aren't receiving, and the irony, construction output. One of the sectors that actually builds things in America contracted by 4.1% because of the tariffs. Agriculture declined by 1.4%. The sectors that build and grow were the ones that bled. This is nail number 9, the Liberation Day lie. Let's go back to April 2nd, 2025, the day the president unveiled a poster board of tariff rates, the day he called Liberation Day, because that day deserves its own chapter in the forensic audit. It was the largest single tariff announcement since Smoot-Hawley. The April 2nd tariffs included a baseline 10% tariff on almost all imports, higher country-specific rates for dozens of trading partners, additional sector-specific tariffs on automobiles, steel, and aluminum. In one stroke, the average effective tariff rate in the United States jumped by 11.5 percentage points. It brought the overall rate to 22.5%, the highest since 1909. The immediate market reaction was brutal. Stock markets plunged, supply chains scrambled, importers panic-bought inventory, trying to get goods into the country before the tariffs hit. That front-running created an artificial spike in imports that temporarily distorted the trade figures. Some observers mistakenly pointed to this surge as evidence the economy was booming. It wasn't booming. It was stockpiling. It was Americans racing to buy things before they got more expensive. That is not economic health. That is hoarding. And then came the chaos within days of the announcement. The administration started adding exemptions, smartphones, exempt auto parts, exempt goods compliant with the USMCA trade agreement, exempt furniture, tariffed, then delayed. Italian pasta tariffed, then paused on New Year's Day 2026 with no explanation. The tariff rate on China went from 10% to 20% to 145%, then back down to 30% after a deal. The acronym Taco Trump always chickens out trended on Wall Street for months. The tariff schedule changed so often that customs brokers, the people whose entire job is knowing what rate applies to what product, couldn't keep up. One tariff consulting firm reported that their clients were spending 10 to 15 hours per month just on tariff-related paperwork, up from 8 to 10 hours before. That doesn't count the cost of the tariff itself. That is just the cost of figuring out what the tariff is this week. Imagine running a business where the tax rate changes every Tuesday. That is not trade policy. That is economic whiplash. And the front-running created its own distortion. Businesses built up massive inventory stockpiles in early 2025, racing to get goods into the country before rates went higher. Morningstar reported that import prices, including tariff costs, rose nearly 10% in 2025, but core goods prices at the consumer level rose only about 1%. The Gap businesses were eating the cost, burning through their cheap pre-tariff inventory, but that inventory is running out, and many businesses announce price hikes starting January 2026. The wave is coming, it just hasn't hit the beach yet. This whiplash didn't just cost money, it cost certainty, and certainty is the one thing businesses need above all else. When you don't know what the tariff rate will be next month, you don't build a factory, you don't hire workers, you don't invest in new equipment, you freeze. And that freeze shows up in the data as clearly as a gunshot wound shows up on an X-ray. Manufacturing construction spending declined in the first 9 months of 2025. Capital investment stalled. The policy designed to build things in America made it irrational to build things in America. But wait, if the tariffs weren't bringing back manufacturing, weren't shrinking the deficit, and were costing the average household over $1,000 a year, surely they were at least raising enough revenue to fund something useful, right? Which brings us to the money itself and where it actually went. This is nail number 10, the fiscal mirage. According to the Richmond Fed, the Department of Homeland Security collected $287 billion in customs duties, taxes, and fees in calendar year 2025. That is up 192% from the prior year. Sounds impressive, right? $287 billion. That is a lot of money. But here is the part they don't put in the press release. The Tax Foundation estimated that tariffs will raise about $2.1 trillion in revenue from 2026 through 2035 on a conventional basis. But once you account for the negative economic effects, the slower GDP growth, the reduced investment, the job losses, that number falls to $1.6 trillion. That is a $500 billion gap between what the tariff collects and what the economy loses because of the tariff. It is like earning $1 and spending $1.30 to earn it. And the tariffs promise to replace income taxes. The math doesn't come close. The tariffs raised about $175 billion in 2026. Federal income tax revenue exceeds $2 trillion. You'd need tariff rates so high they'd shut down international trade entirely. But here is the real fiscal knife twist. The tariffs are supposed to fund the government while cutting taxes elsewhere. But the tax cuts in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill cost far more than the tariffs bring in. The tariff revenue is being used to partially offset an even larger hole in the budget. It is not a revenue strategy. It is a shell game. Move the tax from the rich man's income statement to the poor man's grocery bill, and call it liberation. Speaking of revenue, let's talk about the legal elephant in the room. This is nail number 11, the constitutional crisis. Right now, as you watch this, the Supreme Court of the United States is deciding whether the president even had the legal authority to impose most of these tariffs. The case, Learning Resources versus Trump, challenges the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. As the legal basis for the tariffs, EPA was written in 1977. It was designed to give the president emergency powers to deal with foreign threats. It was used to freeze the assets of terrorist organizations, to sanction dictators, to block transactions with hostile states. It was never intended to reshape the entire U.S. tariff code. During oral arguments in November 2025, both liberal and conservative justices appeared skeptical. The Chief Justice raised the major questions doctrine, the idea that if Congress wants to grant power over decisions of vast economic significance, it has to say so clearly. EPA does not mention tariffs. It does not mention trade deficits. It mentions regulating importation during a declared emergency. The administration's argument boils down to this. Regulating importation includes taxing importation. The challengers say no. Regulating and taxing are fundamentally different constitutional powers. And Congress never explicitly gave the president the power to tax imports through EEPA. Prediction markets give only a 28% chance the court rules in favor of the tariffs. If the IEPA tariffs are struck down, the average tariff rate would drop from 16.1% to 10.4%. And importers who paid those tariffs, over 300,000 importers who filed entries covering more than 34 million shipments, they would be entitled to refunds. The bill could be hundreds of billions of dollars. The fiscal time bomb ticking under this whole structure is real. But even if the court strikes down EEPA tariffs, the administration has made clear it will use other legal authorities to reimpose them. Section 232, Section 301, Section 122. The tariff toolbox is deep. The game of whack-a-mole could go on for years, and every day it continues. Businesses can't plan. Consumers pay more, and the economy bleeds. And that brings us to the final nail, the one that hits hardest because behind every data point, behind every percentage, behind every economic model, there is a person, and this is their story. Nail number 12, the human receipt. Think about the single mother in Houston who works 2 jobs and just watched the price of her kids' school clothes jump 20%. She didn't vote for a tariff, she didn't ask for a trade war. But she is paying for one every time she opens her wallet. Think about the small business owner in Portland who imports craft supplies from Japan. Her costs went up $42,000 a month. She had to lay off 2 employees. They have families too. Think about the farmer in Iowa who lost his biggest soybean contract because China retaliated. He is the 3rd generation on that land. His grandfather built the barn. His father bought the combine. And he might be the one who sells it all because a tariff turned his best customer into an adversary. Think about the factory worker in Michigan who was told his job was coming back. Instead, the factory posted its 8th consecutive month of layoffs. He is 54 years old. He has a mortgage. And the job that was supposed to roar back never showed up. Think about the veteran in Tennessee who started a small import business after his service. He brings in specialty coffee from Colombia. His costs went up 30% overnight. He can't raise prices because his customers are local coffee shops that are already struggling. So he is working longer hours for less money, wondering if the country he served is working for him anymore. Think about the level of cynicism required to announce a policy called Liberation Day that liberates no one, that promises a manufacturing renaissance and delivers a manufacturing recession. That claims foreign countries are writing the check, while the data shows your own citizens paying 96 cents on the dollar. Think about what it means when the very economists inside the Federal Reserve say that the tariffs are responsible for the entirety of inflation above target. And the response is not to adjust the policy, but to blame the messenger. This is the human receipt, the one that doesn't show up in customs data or congressional budget projections. It is the price paid in anxiety, in skipped meals, in businesses that close quietly on a Tuesday afternoon with no headline and no funeral. It is the farmer who can't sleep because his soybean contract vanished. It is the mother who stopped buying name-brand cereal because the price went up 40 cents and 40 cents matters when you are counting. It is the college kid who can't find a summer job because the manufacturer that used to hire temps froze all positions. It is invisible, but it is everywhere. So here we are, the verdict. The books are open, the receipt is on the table, and the forensic audit is clear. It was not foreign countries who paid the tariff. It was Americans. 96 cents of every dollar. It was not manufacturing that was liberated. 72,000 jobs were lost. It was not the trade deficit that shrank. It grew, possibly to a new record. It was not the wealthy who bore the burden. The poorest households paid 3 times the share of the richest. It was not the economy that got stronger. GDP growth slowed by 0.5 percentage point. The economy is permanently $90 billion smaller per year. It was not prices that fell. Inflation rose above the Fed's target, driven entirely by tariffs. Here is the final bill: $287 billion collected in customs duties in 2025, paid by American importers and passed to American consumers. $1,700 per each household in higher prices, $900 for the poorest families. 372,000 manufacturing jobs lost since Liberation Day. 4. The highest average tariff rate since 1935, higher than at any point since before World War XXV. A trade deficit on track to set a new record. 6. GDP permanently reduced by $90 billion per year. 7. 460,000 fewer jobs across the economy. There will be a Supreme Court ruling. There will be political spin. There will be arguments about national security and industrial strategy and the long game. And some of those arguments have merit. Protectionism isn't always wrong. Strategic tariffs on specific industries can serve a purpose. But what we are looking at here is not strategic. What we are looking at is the economic equivalent of chemotherapy administered to a patient who doesn't have cancer. Yes, it kills some cells, But it is killing the healthy ones too. You cannot tax your own citizens $200 billion. Call it a foreign payment and expect the receipt to never come due. You cannot promise jobs while destroying the conditions that create them. You cannot shrink a deficit by making your own exports uncompetitive. You cannot build an economy on a foundation of uncertainty and chaos. And you cannot run from the numbers, because numbers don't care about press conferences. Numbers don't care about Liberation Day. Numbers don't have a political party. The Kiel Institute analyzed 25 million shipping records. Yale's Budget Lab modeled every tariff rate across every sector. The Tax Foundation calculated the distributional burden. The Bureau of Labor Statistics counted the lost jobs. The Federal Reserve measured the inflation. The Congressional Budget Office scored the revenue. Harvard tracked the retail prices. Morningstar forecast the coming wave. They all say the same thing. Americans are paying. Americans have been paying, and until the policy changes or the court rules, Americans will keep paying. The consensus isn't split between left and right. It isn't divided by political allegiance. The data is bipartisan. The receipt doesn't care who you voted for. The data is in, the receipt has been printed, and the question isn't whether Americans are paying for the tariffs. That question was answered by 25 million shipping records. The question is how long they'll keep paying before they demand to see the bill. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps this video get past the algorithm and reach the people who need to see the receipt for themselves. And hit subscribe if you want to be here when we open the next set of books, because the Supreme Court ruling, when it comes, is going to rewrite the rules of presidential economic power. And the audit on that, it is going to be just as wild. I'll see you in the comments. And remember, economics isn't just about money. It is about who pays. And this time, the data is unambiguous. The receipt is in your name. It is in my name. It is in every American's name. And it is still running.